Okay, I guess we can start. Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's panel discussion. I'd like to thank Madisa Zita at Encounters Film Festival. Also, a word of thanks to Katrin Seidel at the Heinrich Böll Foundation, who together with Encounters and the Center for Humanities Research at the University of Western Cape is co-hosting this event this morning. My name is Francois VERSTER. I am an independent documentary filmmaker from Cape Town. I'm also currently the film coordinator of a 4-year-long Mellon-funded project running at the Center for Humanities Research called Communicating the Humanities. Now, one of the aims of this project is to establish greater interaction between the filmmaking community and the academic community, not only locally, but also internationally. So the idea that we're trying to pursue is to encourage a different kind of dialogue. I guess one in which documentary films themselves are seen as concrete outputs of social research or academic research, but basically deals with fundamentally similar questions to more academic research, albeit with very different aesthetic or ethical mechanisms at work. So we're planning to have a number of interactive sessions with filmmakers from around the world over the next semester. And we also hope for this to become a regular feature of the program over the next couple of years. The topic for today's panel is human rights and the representation of Africa. Now, as most of the audience today will know, there's a very long history of problematic representation of Africa in audiovisual and other media, both from outside and inside the continent. And one of the places where, at least in more recent decades, such a trend has surfaced is in the area of human rights. So one tends to find that exposure of or opposition to human rights abuses on the continent are often framed or positioned as outside interventions coming from a non-African space, and often with very little knowledge or acknowledgement either of the complexities of historical context or of existing local resistance, let alone of established local models for problem solving or of alternative historical models of justice or of human interaction as a whole. My own feeling is that the recent rise of the so-called impact film on the global documentary scene often presupposes a series of very clear solutions to complex social and other phenomena that's usually a lot more layered. And I think that many of these kind of films, which are currently very popular, I mean, while they obviously aim to make the world a better place, often end up tipping towards reinforcing or serving a new liberal world order. And I think particularly that being the case when covering subjects within the global south. Now, what intrigues me about today's film is exactly how it negotiates very difficult lines between intervention and documentation, between outsider and insider, and between local knowledge and inherited notions of modernity. And I much look forward to the inputs of everybody here today. So I thought what we could do is if we start with each panelist introducing themselves briefly, and then we'll give a chance for each panelist to respond to the film for about 5 to 7 minutes. We can go a bit longer if needed. And then the filmmakers, Kristen Meyer, will have a chance to respond for between 15 and 20 minutes. And then after that, we can have a maybe more freestyling discussion for a while. And then after that, we'll open the floor to the audience. So if we can start with Christy, if you could maybe introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks, Francois. My name is Christie van Zyl. I'm also known as Makosi Ndosi within the traditional healing space. I am a Sangoma, and I am a Deputy Secretary of the Ubombam Luvuyo Traditional Healers Forum, which was a traditional healers forum that was conceived because of LGBTI members of the traditional healers community being outcasted within traditional spaces. So we needed to create a safe space where we would be accepted, and we would be able to grant grounds of practice for ourselves, because the danger was not getting clients. And so then being unable to practice as a traditional healer, which then kills the gift inside of you. So we have been running the forum since 2015. We are 5 years old this year. I didn't know it was 5 years old this year. And we've really just been addressing a lot of traditional leaders in our spaces, a lot of church leaders, a lot of parents who seem to think that they can send their children to traditional healers to outcast the demons of alternative sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's been the background of my work, a lot of trauma work, and basically just a lot of community work addressing social issues surrounding traditional healing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. I look forward to your inputs. VALMONT LAYNE, could you give us a brief introduction to yourself?
Hello, my name is VALMONT. I'm a student in the program that Francois described earlier, and it's a very exciting sort of place to be coming to think about documentary film in an academic context and the relationship between the making of documentary film and what we're trying to do in the university space. My own background, I've worked in the cultural sector for most of my career. I've been a museum curator, an activist, and the kinds of questions that have occupied my mind have to do with the tension, I guess, from the point of view of Cape Town and South Africa, thinking about how communities, how people mobilize their own sense of modernity, their own sense of tradition, in fairly contradictory ways through the medium of music making mostly, and the relationship between jazz and those notions in Cape Town. So yeah, I mean, I'm very glad to be here and to be thinking about these questions as a student again. Thanks.
Thanks, VALMONT. And then if we can move to Steve, if you could give a brief introduction to yourself. Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Francois, and thanks for inviting me here. So my name is Steve AKOTH. I am an anthropologist by training and largely practice. I teach at Kenyatta University in Kenya, but I also do research in areas that relate a lot to some of the ideas that I see in this project that you do, Francois. One is that I've been pushing my students to think about the academic text beyond the written text, to think about social text, to think about film as text, performance as text. And one thing that I did is that 5 years ago, I worked with a student at the French Cultural Center here in Nairobi with the University of Toronto to do a play around Luanda Magere. Luanda Magere is an old legendary story, and I used that to perform some ideas in my own dissertation. So this confliction between academic texts and worldly texts is something that I'm very interested in, and I look forward to conversations today. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you. We've got an exciting and well-informed panel to speak about the film. And then I thought if our stars for the day, Kristen Meyer, I know you guys have been traveling around the world with the film, whether virtually or in person, and I'm very happy to be able to be one of the hosts to have you at UWC today. If you could maybe also just give a brief idea on who you are, what your background in filmmaking or otherwise might be.
So thank you so much for having us on this panel. We're very excited to see where the conversation goes. My name is Maia Lekow, and I am a Kenyan filmmaker and musician. And
I'm Chris King, originally from Australia, but been living in Nairobi since 2007. We're a wife and husband filmmaking team. The letter was made over 6 years, and it's our first
feature.
Our first film that we've directed, produced, myself on camera, Maia on sound. She's also a musician and film composer. So yeah, we're really glad to be here, and thanks so much for seeing the film, and really looking forward to the feedback.
So if we do have time for some more practical discussion, it'd be good to ask about how a wife and a husband make a film together. But let's see. Okay, so let's start with Christie. So as I say, we have 5 to 7 minutes scheduled per respondent, but if you want to go longer, that should not be a problem. So over to you.
Okay, all right. So I wasn't able to listen in on Maia Maganthri and Chris's talk last night. I'm really sorry. But I think that what the film did really well, which other African productions do struggle to do, is to tell the story from both perspectives. The telling of the story from the perspective of believing in the indigenous African practices and from the perspective of suppressing the indigenous African practices. And I think for me, it was also the bringing into the story of how Western culture then influenced African practices and how that still dominates today. Because for instance, for me, I saw very well how the movie goes into a space where the curing of this supposed accusation of witchcraft on Nyanya comes from the Western perspective of belief systems. And within that, the same belief system that vilifies African practices, coming from a family that is vilifying African practices as well, but very much believing in witchcraft, but not believing in the witchcraft as in the negative aspect of indigenous practices, but not quite necessarily giving any recognition to the positive aspect of the indigenous African practices. When Carissa went on that venture to find the medicine man who was going to be able to assist with the traditional oath, there was not much that was spoken of about the traditional oath. And I wish that the documentary could have gone into an exploration of spaces where people have actually utilized the traditional oath. Yes, there was the space where Carissa spoke to his friends, but I wish there could have been a space where we could have addressed elders who had been accused of witchcraft and had also used the traditional oath, so that the world can also see that aspect of the indigenous practice. I am not sure why we didn't delve into it in the documentary filmmaking, perhaps a sensitive topic. And I do also very much recognize that in African countries and in African indigenous practices, sometimes some things are too sacred to show on film or to expose to the world. But at least maybe a conversation with elders that could have spoken about the wonders perhaps that the traditional oath could have and had done for them, because the danger to someone who doesn't know, who is looking at a narrative in which the story was told, would then be looking at a complete vilification of indigenous practices, and sort of like a brushing on the surface of traditional practices, and perhaps needing to mention it so that it's not questioned or seen as erased or alienated at all. But to someone on the inside, perhaps on the African continent, who does know about our indigenous practices, would then think there was more of a focus on Western religion curing this accusation of witchcraft, where we ourselves within indigenous African practices have forms of exercising negative energies, have forms of cleansing stigmas around witchcraft, which within our own indigenous practices, as the traditional oath had spoken of. But I wish there could have been more information around it, more documenting of people who have actually taken the traditional oath before and seen how it's worked for them, and witnessing of how the traditional oath has worked for them as well. because that would then also give some highlighting to the traditional oath. And then another thing is the removing of agency, which there was a lot of in the movie. There was a removal of agency from Nyanya to be able to speak up for herself, in terms of having a family meeting where family members were not willing at all to hear Nyanya's side of the story. They were speaking from their side of the story, and they were speaking from what the community was saying about Nyanya. And Carissa was the only one that was really interested in finding out what was going on with Nyanya, but there was no one time where, you know, for instance, when I'm not sure if it's the daughter that was trying to organize a meeting with the family and with the priests before they come, or the pastors before they come and pray this thing away, to come and speak about what are the actual activities that they saw Nyanya do. And perhaps Nyanya speaking up for herself and saying the reason why I was doing these activities was this and this and that, and not it automatically being attached to witchcraft. And then perhaps the family consulting a traditional practitioner, a diviner, that would be able to then explain what these things are that they are seeing, and then giving Nyanya a voice and a backup as well to say, you know, these are the things that I've been practicing, and this is what you've been seeing. And within our ancient indigenous practices, the reason why I took on these things that I've been doing is this and this and that, or perhaps what you have been seeing is this and that and that. And a traditional practitioner, them consulting a diviner, which is the language that they use, who then is able to explain, you know, what it is that they are seeing and why they are seeing it. And perhaps, you know, consulting a diviner could have been able to speak to perhaps generational curses that are sitting in the bloodline, generational traumas, and you know, addressing that, because within all of this accusations towards Nyanya and her witchcraft, nobody looks to Nyanya's own ill fortunes and tries to find out what is the cause of Nyanya's own ill fortunes before the stigma of witchcraft was placed onto her. People are talking about, oh, we're unable to have kids, oh, and we're unable to have business, oh, land issues, etc. You know, nobody ever looked at this at Nyanya's children as children that are trying to take her land away from her at all. You know, they looked at other people's families and how their children in the community are trying to take land away, but nobody took the focus back to the family, asking about, you know, could you guys possibly be trying to take Nyanya's land away by accusing her of witchcraft and thereby getting her killed? Because, I mean, there's also an insinuation of having land and it linking to abundance and it linking to fertility as well, because there was the link to Nyanya saying that when she started giving birth 1 year after the other is the time that her father gave her land. And then she lost 8 of her kids and nobody asks themselves why. And she had that hip issue and nobody asks themselves how that happened. Nobody ever gave Nyanya that moment to be able to speak for herself on those activities that she had. And let me just look a little bit through my notes a little bit. So there was another thing I wanted to say about Nyanya in terms of generational curses and how in resolution to this supposed witchcraft accusation against Nyanya, there was a complete focus on a Western exorcism per se, and not, you know, bringing together of how the family could have said, okay, let's bring together these two things. Yes, they very much believed in Christianity, but I never saw a moment where Carissa came up to his family and said, guys, I've done some research. on the traditional oath, and I found a home where there's elders who are actually vilified in our communities for this witchcraft. And, you know, there's a solution like this, and giving Nyanya and the family, you know, an option, you know, to look at combining these two things, because unfortunately we do live in the 21st century, and as much as we may want to speak of, we want to bring back the way that things used to be done, unfortunately we're also dealing with generations that are born into the Western ways of influence, and so that's how you find Nyanya believing so much in the church, even though it's the very church's influence that has influenced the community to vilify her and accuse her of witchcraft. So that's how you find Nyanya very much in so much, because the church, you know, the colonization took her into a space like that, and offered, you know, a different narrative, which you know, she wasn't actually able to be immersed in or understand, because when she had passed and able to get education, her mother, you know, took away that agency from her and kept her in the homestead, and she then had to live a lifelong narrative of being kept in the homestead as a mother hen, per se. So, I mean, there's just a few of the things that I wish the film could have spoken to, addressing, or maybe talks around it, you know, around the taking away of Nyanya's agency, which is my biggest thing, and the not consulting by the family of African indigenous practices that could have restored the dignity of the family. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. We're on 12 minutes, so thanks, Christie. So thanks for the keen insights. I think there's a lot to consider here, and I think one of the points that we could maybe explore further that you raise is also the notion of what is the role of the film. Is the film giving you know, guidelines for the way forward, or is the film merely a documentation process that shows what is? So that balance between a film being an instrument of communication versus being an instrument of exploration, which I think is also a big question within the you know, the relationship between academic exploration of films and filmmaking perspective. So maybe we can also try to speak about that. But thanks a lot for that. So VALMONT, if we can move on to you, the second respondent.
Thanks, and I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you for a beautiful film, for a very moving and thought-provoking experience. I like the fact that the film doesn't offer us easy answers, that it allows us in, and it asks us to think and to feel with, especially Nyanya, the central character. I like the fact, well, let me first say, I think in thinking about the question about the representation of Africa in working through these human rights questions, I want to kind of decenter the word representation and think about constituting and making. I think there's films like these do also, and I guess the whole enterprise of public engagement. In that enterprise, we all have agency, and films like this have agency. They enable us to produce and to propose different ways of engaging with these realities. And so maybe representation is a word that takes some of that agency away. And I want to kind of think about that. I also want to, I guess the film asks questions about the colonial encounter, and it in a sense, I guess what I'm coming to is that people make their own choices, even when their agency is taken away. There are certain difficulties that people then are left with, and in those difficulties, I think the possibility for real kind of poetic engagement with it arises. And what something like this calls for is maybe a deeper or a greater engagement with this notion of the modern and the tradition. I think it's important because a film like this allows us to move a little bit beyond the limitations of binarism. You know, we think about the modern on the one hand and traditional on the other, and in fact, there's a lot of scope for what lies in between. In the history of the colonial encounter, that is where the real work happens. Often resistance to the impositions of colonialism, to the dispossessions that happen, often take place in this kind of very nuanced, refined, difficult spaces that sort of overlap between the personal and the public, and one sees it in this film. There's in kind of Cape historiography, we talk about respectability and the engagement with the Christian belief system, also with Islam, and this film sort of I think provoked quite a little bit and helped me to think about it in a much more sort of cosmopolitan context across the continent. While it keeps our sympathy focused on Carissa and Nyanya and her persecution, it also, I think, through Carissa's attempts to follow, to try to be even-handed in understanding what's going on, I think you do manage to find a balance, although it may not be a satisfying balance. I don't know if you can have a satisfying engagement with something like this. And so sometimes one gets a sense that, in fact, Carissa says during the course of the film that he's confused. He's generally struggling to reconcile his love for his grandmother with other forces, you know, with his kind of more patriarchal respect for his uncles particularly, and that the pressures of a patriarchal experience come to bear upon him. I'm very interested in your bias as a musician, because I think the truth of the film is in the poetics, in the kind of evocative. The cinematography is beautiful. The film has these expansive moments when we are engaging with the really fine detail of rural life, of elements of the natural world in it. And I wanted to hear you, maybe Mia particularly, talk a little bit about how you envisaged the atmosphere you wanted to create in the film as an artist, and are you happy with what you were able to produce, or how do you how does it sit with you now? And then finally, I think we have made the point that there is a tremendous amount of amazing scholarship and the research that has gone on around, and I think Steve will perhaps reflect on it, the making of the colonial order and the place that notions of tradition and modernity has played in all of that. And I would be interested to hear a little bit more about, I know in the scoping of the film, you were working with oral histories, and your project was historical, and you had set out to try to think about it in terms of historical inquiry, and I would be interested to hear how you engage with that. So, but yeah, thank you for a very engaging film.
Thank you, VALMONT. So more to think on there, and I think particularly the notion of a binarism between tradition and modernity being challenged, and then also the idea of film working on a aesthetic or poetic level that maybe gives in itself a mode of understanding, or is in itself a mode of intervention into a situation. And it would be good to unpack that a little bit further. So Steve, if we can move on to you, it'd be great to get your inputs.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot, Maia and Chris, for this good work. I got the privilege of watching this with my daughter, and Maia, maybe, I don't know if my daughter got in touch with Maia or Chris when I got the initial link, when she wanted to get the longer film. And my daughter is a student of film and cinema, so she's my very good teacher in this. But I must say that this is a piece of, in my opinion, excellent ethnography as an anthropologist. I think you've really partnered with the Mijikenda. So Nyanya belongs to the larger category of the Mijikenda, who mainly inhabit the coast of Kenya. And there are many sub-segments of Mijikenda. I didn't quite know which segment they belong to. It seemed to me like they're Choni or close to there, but you'll tell us. But most likely
Giriyama.
Giriyama. And I liked you taking us to various spaces there. You know, it's a real classical post-colonial production there, which destroys the binaries completely, because you take us to the Kaya and you bring us back to church and you bring us back to the shopping center and take us to the youth base, Maskani, and you bring us back to the Matatu. So it's a real good circulation. And as my colleagues have said, you produce and circulate a very good post-colonial text, which I think is very rich. And one of the things, therefore, that happens is that you become a partner in work. You do two things. You say, what do you do when you encounter people who have already written something about themselves? And Christianity, as it were, tries to rewrite something again about them. And then they don't push Christianity away. They take it, appropriate it, and you see huge struggles between their own history and living stories, the way they have it, and the kind of narrative that Christianity and Christianity is just a symbol of one of the modernity axioms that sort of intervene in that society. So I like that. Now, when I read it alongside a book or works I'm reading now. I'm reading the works of Francis Nyamjo. Francis Nyamjo is an anthropologist based at UCT, and he's recently written about cannibalism. And in this writing is written about being eaten and eating others. And I could see how Nyanya is being eaten and how the eaters are behaving. So I like this. It's a very cannibalistic space there where we see the eating and being eaten. And cannibalism is not just about sort of literally the literal meaning in eating human flesh and so on, but it's a language that gives us epistemological possibility of thinking about questions such as what is dignity, what is humanness, what is belonging, what is civilization, what is culture, and so on. And it is those categories, those vocabularies that then situates this documentary, in my opinion, in the realm of human rights. Because the question that I saw, the central question that I saw was about unsettling things that are strange and things that are seen to be outside, and building a common humanity and equality where everybody can access human dignity. So even the eaters, those who see Nyanya as a witch doctor or a witch, for instance, are in this struggle towards human dignity, and that's how to see it. So ultimately, the question of human rights here is not the human rights in the way you read it from the United Nations or from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but you see it as a struggle to rewrite and re-engage scripts of personhood. And those scripts of personhood are weaved or try to unfold themselves in a space of sort of varying ideas of rationality. And so those varying ideas of rationality then are in competition to define, so what is human dignity? Because we have these varying ideas of rationality, and we have varying ideas of what should be inside, what should be outside, what is strange, what makes us better human, and so on. So that struggle is not just a struggle of Nyanya alone. It's a struggle of the entire ecosystem interlocutors in the movie. And I like that a lot. And I see 4 things that I want to point out as my discussion points after giving that background of my epistemological understanding of the work. One is the struggle of the so-called belief systems. So you see various forms of Christianity. You see the classical Anglican Christianity, where you see this priest in a church and so on. Then you see I like this performance at the home when there's a cleansing ceremony. And the two Christian framings, all based on a biblical extraction. And one is based on a classical, and you know, the contradiction is very interesting. Nyanya, who is claimed to be a witch, situates her Christianity within a classical Anglican model, which valorizes the Western culture of Christianity. Those who accuse Nyanya of being a witch practice a Christianity model, which is based on the importations of what is done within the witch context. So you saw the exorcist movement. They want to catch the spirit and throw it away. And then Nyanya's, I think, daughter comes to the Bible, the very classical way. So these guys are using the witch rationality and script to catch the spirit and dispose of it or exorcise it. But this one, who should be the witch group, is coming with the Bible. So this contradiction is very interesting. And I would like to suggest that perhaps, Kristen, you may come back and see that there's an active play of agency there. Nyanya's agency is not expunged off at all. It is so active because the positionality that she's acquired performs a very powerful agency. And it produces very interesting contradictions, a real manifestation of really what we've called postcolonial. So you see the Anglican priest, we see the traditional priests, we see the Africanist, indigenous, Pentecostal religion, and so on. And that, I think, is a very good encounter. And I like that multiple rationalities and how they perform in building some things. Then there's the issue of alterity, that there is an active project of producing otherness. So there's a way the Anglican Church sees those who don't subscribe to the script of Anglicanhood as being others. There's a way those who see Nyanya to be old and so see her as an other. There are those who see Nyanya's lingua, imagined conduct, produces her as an other. And there's a way the structural problems of land, food insecurity, relationship with the national government does produce an othering. So there's an active system of alterities there, which is deep, and I couldn't understand it fully. And I would really be happy to hear your own take of, are you dealing with 9 worlds, 20 worlds? Because there are multiple worlds that you build in there. And all those worlds are unable to build one humanness. They are all really creating fractures. Because look, those, for example, who are accused to be witches, they go and live in the kaya. Nyanya is not in the kaya, but she can't interact with the society. Anglican church members cannot interact with the Pentecostal movement members who also call themselves Christians. Then there's generation questions and so on. So these multiple worlds is very interesting, how alterity is produced, which is something that moves beyond Edward Said's idea of othering, because in that form then, othering is not just produced in the form of so-called West versus non-West, but it is also produced within ongoing contemporary contradictions of our time, be it generational, be it economic, be it anxieties over resources like land, be it who is in charge of the kaya, and so on. So very interesting alterity questions. The third point, and I said there are 4 points, the third point is about ethnography. It's very difficult for we scholars, and I think that's why also, Francois, as you say, this project is very important. We scholars, when we do our work, we always create distinction between the field and the academy. This film helped us to merge the film and the academy in a very interesting way, because I can see the film directors acting as very good anthropologists and working to co-produce the narrative of Giriyama and with these various fabrics, and in a very fluid, slippery, and unstable manner. But I can also see the various members of that film scenario producing different texts depending on their positionalities. And the difficulty in the film, and which the film does very well, is to try and give space to the various textures of the ethnographic texts that are emerging and weave them together to form a very interesting mosaic. And I think the production of that mosaic is something that we in the academy should learn, really how to build an ethnographic text as a mosaic that sort of weaves together various forms of narrations based largely on positionality. The last point that I want to make is a point about a prejudice, unmet expectations of modernity, and abandonment. And those ones also makes this film very relevant in this moment of COVID-19, because what you see in the film is a series of abandonments. First, as Christine said in the beginning, the idea of familial links is abandoned and everyone is left to be on their own. And what you are becomes your own. And the initial scripts of what is a family, how does family behave, how does family relate, is completely scattered. And that is what this moment of COVID-19 has done. We all are abandoned, we're left by ourselves, and what we are is our own, and what we become is our own. And that is what we see in that film. But that abandonment at that time is not because of a pandemic of medical pathological nature, but is a problem of prejudice versus what I call expectations of modernity. So, because of these multiple rationalities, this social community is completely divided. So what is accepted traditional and what is modern and what is accepted modern? And what you can see is competition around those key components of becoming. So becoming a Giriyama is very difficult in this time. How do you remain a Giriyama when you age? How do you remain a Giriyama when you are young? How do you remain a Giriyama when you're an Anglican? How do you remain a Giriyama when you're a Kaya elder? How do you remain a Giriyama if you have land? How do you remain a Giriyama if you have no land? How do you remain a Giriyama if you live in Nairobi? And so on. These are the questions. And some of the ideas that were initially valorized and constituted Giriyamahood have been scattered by the ideas of being a modern Giriyama. And the questions we must ask ourselves is, if you're a Giriyama, can you defect? Or is it that if you're a Giriyama, you must always remain a particular kind of Giriyama? For example, the priest was a Giriyama.
Steve, I'm just wondering, we're on 15 minutes and we are a bit limited with time. Might we be able to come back to the question?
Just 5 seconds, just 5 seconds. So how do you merge the various components? And the priest really struggled with that, because when the guys come to the compound and he wonders, should I stand? Should I confront them? Should I leave? Thank you. Sorry, I took too much time.
Sorry to interrupt you. It's just we do have a limited slot this morning, so we've encounters as advisors to be quite strict about that. Okay, so guys, there's a lot to think about, a lot of very different inputs, and I think what's interesting for me, looking from the outside, is how all three respondents have given very different insights, but in some way they're also directly related, which I think points to the not only to your skills as filmmakers, but I think also to the idea of documentary being able to straddle multiple realities, multiple emotional, multiple political realities. And I think, as Steve pointed out, the notion of alterity is key to the film, the notion of othering. And I think this is, as filmmakers, as documentary, especially as social and particularly observational documentary filmmakers, this is a key question, is how do you deal with otherness? Because documentary is obviously always in some level dependent on otherness. You show people things that they don't know, but what are the politics of otherness? How does the othernesses play out in the film itself? And I think this is also linked to VALMONT's earlier point around the idea of agency in itself, because, how is agency negotiated? What is the role that Carissa, for example, plays and how does that relate to the questions that Christie raised about the agency that Nyanya has in the film? So I presume you've taken some notes. I can quickly summarize some of the points if you like, or would you like to jump ahead and respond?
There's a lot of notes, a lot of comments, but we've written them all down. So maybe we can just bounce around a little bit and just explain our process and some of these points. So firstly, we just wanted to also just let you all know that Nyanya passed away a few weeks ago. And she didn't pass away from anything, from witchcraft or anything that's happened within this film, but she just passed away from old age, and she died peacefully on a chair outside as she was looking over her land. So we just wanted to let you know that first and foremost, and I'm glad that we were able to document her life and for her spirit to continue.
I guess going back to Christie's early point, which were really interesting about, I guess, the elements of the oath, and also to what VALMONT mentioned about our kind of original, like, historical roots of the film. This was definitely a big interest for us, and was a big part of the genesis of the film. I mean, we filmed for 2 years up and down the coast, trying to find what it was, the story we were trying to tell. We initially set out to make a film about a female freedom fighter who led an armed uprising against the British during the First World War. Her name was Mekatilili Wamenza. And Maia's father's family is from the coast and from this area. She'd grown up in Nairobi and didn't grow up with a close connection to that part of her heritage. So around the time we got married, we decided to go on this journey, and we wanted to spend more time at the coast. We wanted to meet relatives and really investigate the story of this woman who was a mythical figure, but really nothing was written about.
At the age of 70, who revolted against the British through kind of this particular dance called Kifudu, which is bringing the people together to revolt against the British.
Yeah, and using oathing and I guess all the metaphysical elements of the kaya to really come up with a weapon that the British just could not take on. They couldn't, through her boycott and her armed uprising, everyone refused to work on the plantations, everyone refused to, on the colonial plantations, everyone refused to go and fight for the British during the war. So kind of this woman's story was our first point of inquiry. And as we traveled around the coast, we met a lot of traditional practitioners, community groups who were keeping her memory alive. And one of these groups was the Kaya we visited in the film, Kaya Godoma, which is really in the kind of hinterland of the kind of Giriama nation, if you look at it that way. And a lot of the elders who we spoke to, the ones who were maybe around during the time of Mekatilili or may know stories from her time, were the same elders who had all been chased away from their families and were sheltering in these shelters. And we're really I guess shocked by this by this kind of status quo that seemed to be a normal thing along the coast, where a lot of young people were considering anyone that wears traditional clothing or anyone that practices any of the traditional belief system, anyone that plays the Giriama music, all kind of being demonized as practicing Satan worship. And this is a lot of the brainwashing that seems to have happened over the course of 100 years since the first Christian missionaries arrived at the coast, that we found a real problem. And another problem we found was the difficulties in telling a historical documentary that could be kept engaging and interesting.
Can I just add something just to your point before that?
Yeah.
Was also like, I think it was Steve, your question was also about how, you know, there's these kind of challenges between the Giriama people, I think African people as a whole, when the missionaries first came, essentially how were they converting people to Christianity, and how were they also, which is interesting, is that very fragile line between traditional beliefs but within the Christian faith. So I think there's this kind of like completely like muddled up, yeah, I just don't know if we know where we were. Yeah.
I mean, it was all very complex, and we saw what Mekatilili was fighting for was really this kind of pivotal point in history where I guess different stories and different power bases were in conflict, and her struggle was really to keep the Giriama culture alive, was to keep the Giriama political system and economic system alive, as well as language and knowledge, and the fact that you know, when she led the uprising, the British really persecuted her as a witch. There's only the kind of documentation of her existence is through these colonial letters written from the Kenya colony back to Britain, explaining that there is this witch on the loose and she's turning everyone against them. And so when we started speaking to these elders, a lot of them weren't so much interested in sharing that history with us. They were more concerned about their personal safety and what was happening. And we found this issue as being, you know, an interesting study for a film where we could explore the kind of history and politics and cultural conflict that was happening. But it was important for us. We decided early on we wanted to find a space or a family where this was actually unfolding in front of us, to be able to understand more the complexities and nuances of that kind of personal experience.
And just to add to that, like the challenges of a kind of a historical film is also difficult because we didn't have much about her. You know, reenacting things were difficult, and a lot of the elders that we were speaking to, it was a very kind of social issue of things that were happening, but at the same time is that we were still lacking, for us anyway as documentary filmmakers, is that we were still lacking that emotional, intimate connection that we wanted for in the film for people to then be able to resonate, you know, on the continent and worldwide. And so as Chris says, is that we were filming for 2 years. We have a lot of footage, mainly kind of with the cultural organizations many oathing ceremonies, you know, many kind of dances happening at certain times. We have really a lot, but for us, and then from there, then when we met Karisa, our main character, who actually came over to our place in Nairobi to help us translate some Giriama footage. We both speak Swahili, but we don't speak Giriama. And it was then that he was then saying, this is happening to my nyanya right now. I've just received a Facebook message. So that's how then our kind of much more personal, intimate story then began with him and his grandmother.
If I can speak a bit about the decision to, I guess, to steer away from, I guess, using a lot of the footage we captured of rituals and especially the Kiapo oath that gets performed to many people. For us, it was really mainly a conflict of sticking with the story of the Kamango family. And because within the Kamango family there wasn't a traditional oath that was performed, taking that step out of the family, which is something that like we tried to do for so long in our edit, I mean, our editor, Ricardo Acosta, who's Toronto-based but from Cuba, also had an amazing emotional understanding and spiritual understanding of what we were dealing with. But every time we tried to work that in, it just felt like it took us too far away from the experience of the Kamango family and felt too forced, and went down that road, that slippery slope of ethnography, which we were trying to avoid, and tell a more personal and intimate story in which the politics and the culture and the history were in there more on a subliminal level. So yeah, I mean, we'd still love to do something with all that footage. There are a lot of ethical issues around showing these kind of secret things, but they seem to be, at least the people we filmed were happy for it to be shown. But that was our struggle. We are working on an educational version of the film that is going to travel around the coast, and we are thinking about integrating a bit more of that into a cut that's built to like create more discussion on that cultural issue. But yeah, at the time we had to really make a difficult decision.
I wanted to just quickly about VALMONT, your point.
And also, if I can say, if anyone also wants to chime in instead of us just speaking.
Yeah, you just let us know when.
For however long, more than welcome.
But Carissa's stance was a really interesting point that I want to just quickly take, and then also the musical thing. So for Carissa, he had a really strong love for his grandmother and grew up with his grandmother. And you can really feel that. But what's been interesting, and I think with also a lot of young people from the coast, is that they believe, but they don't believe. So for us initially, like, you know, we were, you know, thinking that maybe he would take kind of a stronger stance and that wasn't the case. And I think we were kind of, as filmmakers, potentially like putting something on him that he did not have, which was, you know, yeah, go out there and let's, you know, fight this thing. And that was kind of the initial kind of stance that we had. And then what we realized is that this is not who he is. And I think also not a lot of young guys from the coast are like that. So how do we then just play it naturally as it is, where he kind of goes in between and he really does kind of sway depending on who he talks to. But at the same time, he does have a very strong rooted love for his grandma. So that was kind of interesting for us to kind of figure out how to show that in the edit.
But on top of that, he also had approached everyone with respect from both sides, and we really kind of followed his lead and learned a lot as well in terms of his neutrality and how that helped to like really help give an insight for the film on both sides. Yeah. We were, of course, a little bit nervous when we went to visit Carissa's uncles, who in the end were also happy that their side of the story was being shared. And it was important for us to approach them with the same respect that Carissa showed as a young man in the family. And then also, yeah, for, I guess the human rights tradition, or I guess in which films are being made about problematic issues, it was important for us that, yeah, the film wasn't taking any particular stance and was really putting it on the audience to use their own,
to make up their own minds,
and to use their own experience in their own politics and their own kind of ideas and relationships with their own family. Yeah, we really wanted to leave space for individual audience members to put that in.
If I may jump in there, I agree with you on that question of human rights. What I saw was indeed there's a word I've used which I've called scripts of personhood, where I think the idea here is that human rights, as I write it in the film, is that it's not sort of this, you know, conventions from the UN or conventions from, but it's mainly about issues of equity, issues about how to deal with prejudice, and issue of human dignity, because the outcome of human rights is human dignity. And I saw that the question there, everybody was in a corner agreeing on one common thing, that, well, we all need this humanity, a relational mode, but we also need dignity for each other that sort of insulates us from this perpetual fear.
Yeah, and I mean, on the ground, the idea of human rights is such an abstract concept. It's, yeah, I, especially in people who consider themselves to be in a world of like spiritual warfare and, yeah, all these competing ideas and competing stories and competing belief systems. Yeah, there was no clean way to approach it. And it was just important for us that, yeah, that complexity could be expressed, and also like the deep love also that existed between so many people, which for me, as someone who's come from Australia, and from an outsider perspective, seeing that utmost respect that exists within the culture for elderly people and for the knowledge that they possess, while at the same time that being at huge risk of being lost forever. If these kind of phenomena are allowed to just continue. So I think like as filmmakers, we really saw our role as simply telling this story as faithfully
and as honestly as possible,
and as honestly and with as much passion as we could to help trigger conversations like this, and hopefully just hold up a mirror that can help people understand different perspectives, and take it from there. I did want to mention.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just something about Nyanya's agency that Kristen mentioned that was interesting, and I guess to add a small insight into how the film was formed over time. We filmed over several years, and we would come back and we would edit footage in Nairobi, and then we'd go back down to Kaloleni and continue filming. And during that time, we would kind of show different sequences to Nyanya and different family members of how we're progressing, and giving them a better idea of kind of what the film was going to look like. Yeah, at that point, Nyanya, obviously, when we first filmed her, she, I think, really enjoyed the opportunity to give her side of the story, and that we were interested in hearing her voice. After seeing some of the sequences, she kind of came back with many edit notes and even a touch of frustration, I would say, in that she was adamant that it was really important that she be seen to be a Christian woman, that even the stories of her childhood, she just, like, in her lounge room, she just kind of opened floodgates of all these things. And that's the moment when we decided just to do an audio interview of her as all of this stuff came out. And that's what kind of became the spine of those kind of monologue sequences of Nyanya talking about her past and her life, and it was important for us to just give her that podium where ultimately the film hopefully acted as her agency being able to come out, and also her having the final word, which was definitely important for us, that hopefully offset the complete lack of agency that had been afforded to her by other family members.
Yeah, I want to add so much, but I don't think we have time, do we, Francois?
I was just wondering if I could bring back the conversation to the topic of the panel. I mean, you guys are working filmmakers. You work within a industry that's partly commercially funded, but it's also partly grant funded. And in recent years, social documentary funders have been increasingly funded by corporations as tax breaks and so on. I'm not sure whether you guys were part of the Good Pitch Kenya, for example. So for those of you that don't know, the Good Pitch is an initiative put together by the Brit Doc Foundation, whereby social documentary makers are teamed up either with corporate funders or with NGOs to see where there is overlap in the interest. But it seems to me that, as I mentioned in the introduction, that there's a lot of pressure on documentary makers, particularly within this sort of era of impact filmmaking, and maybe possibly also in the kind of the atmosphere of world politics as we see it, where people are becoming increasingly polarized. There's a lot of emphasis or a lot of pressure on filmmakers to deliver answers. So you see a lot of films that do very well at the box office. They kind of take you through a problem and they come out with a position at the end. If you go to this website and do that and that and that, then you would have done your bit, which is obviously quite problematic because I think it over assumes agency on the viewer's part, but it's also tends to decontextualize the difficulty of the situation. And it seems to me that your film, in a number of ways, circumvents that, and I think a couple of them have been discussed. And I think one in particular is exactly the fact that you have almost a kind of a third character in the form of Carissa. He doesn't take sides strongly enough, which I'm sure some people find problematic, but in a way, he becomes a vehicle for the audience to make up their own minds. So through him, you give the audience space. So in a way, it's quite fortunate that he's, in a way, quite I mean, not a weak character, but not a very, kind of strident or made-up character. So I'm just wondering, also in the light of the questions posed by Christie, I mean, if film is seen, I don't know what the right word, if the question is to improve a human rights situation, to address human rights concerns, but if the idea of a documentary or social documentary is to make the world a better place, because I think that's what we all aim for. And so we're not only documenting, even if we're not prescribing, we're not solely documenting. I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more to that, also in the light, obviously, of certain having to make choices. I mean, like, so Christie, for example, would have liked more information. Other people would have probably liked more information, other elements and so on. As filmmakers, you have to tread a line, as you mentioned, of a watchable story, usually with the main character that takes you through an emotional journey. But at the same time, you are trying to say something meaningful about the world without reducing the complexity of that world to, kind of the standard political questions around it. So I was just wondering, I mean, as filmmakers, for our filmmaking audience out there, I mean, what kind of thoughts or advice do you have on that?
It's a really interesting question, and definitely something that's important here, especially talking about where the documentary kind of industry is in Kenya, where you've got a situation where we don't have a national fund or kind of state support for independent documentary filmmaking, or kind of any real cultural practice or creative endeavor at all. A lot of the areas where filmmakers work are basically, working for NGOs to make documentaries about whatever messaging is going on, and a lot of that is within the human rights sphere. So it's it sometimes feels in conflict because a lot of that work kind of feels a bit more in the realm of like advertising or marketing for a particular organization and whatever their projects are and whatever they have to show to their donors. That's often done through film. So we kind of had to unlearn a lot of those practices that happen within that mode of filmmaking, and there is a lot of unlearning happening as films like Softy, which is also at Encounters by Sam Soko, and I Am Samuel by Pete Marimi. We're kind of seeing kind of a new wave that's really come out of an organization like DocuBox, where we were all incubated, that are really putting a concentration on kind of character-driven stories with, I guess, a more masterful use of narrative and how that can ultimately bring out a stronger message of human rights and allow us to, I guess, get deeper into the conversations and more meaningful, hopefully, towards that goal of making the world a better place. But a lot of it for us just came down to craft, and this was our film school. This film, we hadn't done it before. We made a lot of mistakes. But thankfully had enough support to get us over the end. And I don't know what else to say on that.
Yeah, no, Francois, I'm sorry. The question, Chris, that's fine. I actually didn't quite catch your whole question, but I think Chris has answered it accordingly.
Maybe, hopefully. Sorry.
Okay, guys, so we've got 3 questions from the floor, but before we move to the floor, Christie, VALMONT, Steve, is there anything you'd like to follow up or ask to the filmmakers?
Yes, I have one question which they spoke to, but not in its complete form. I was really wondering, maybe you can come back to that later, but to what extent was the narrative, a performance by the various interlocutors? It would be great if you at some point let us know which components or in the narrative in the film were sort of these spontaneous moments, and which moments were sort of deliberately performed. Sort of going a bit to the back to understand that. Thank you.
I mean, there was nothing really that was performed apart from just recapturing the wide shot of Carissa walking to the kaya, essentially. And actually, it was funny because we had one Auntie Zawadi, the other lady who's sitting next to Nyanya, who's quite comical during that cleansing sequence. She just trying to also understand people coming into our home, understanding exactly like what it was that we were there for, just being able to navigate that space and just her feeling completely comfortable with us. And it was a little bit of a tricky back and forth, but the cleansing sequence, for example, it was her who called us. We'd come back to Nairobi, and it was her who called us and said, these people are coming to my house, to our house. Nyanya's life is in danger, and we want you and Carissa to come back. So we actually then just got onto a night bus and came back to kind of support Nyanya, and also then potentially then have this extremely unique moment to be able to film the cleansing sequence or the prayer sequence.
Yeah, and I mean, in short, the everything you saw in the film actually happened.
Yeah.
Of course, we can't pretend that we didn't affect any events at all. I mean, someone standing in the corner with a camera filming you eating breakfast, you're going to behave a little bit differently. But we really spent a lot of time getting to know everyone and allowing them to know us without the camera. And it was really after kind of several weeks of being around each other that we started getting footage that was just natural, and that's really what we were looking for. So yeah, we went back and picked up a couple of establishing shots, but as far as the scenes and the conversations that happened, that was all spontaneous. Carissa said, let's go speak to this family member. We just followed him. We would say hello, this is what we're doing. Do you mind if we film? And once they were okay, we just sit down with the camera and the conversation would happen, and we would add questions here and there. But otherwise, it all unfolded spontaneously without us saying, oh, we'd love to get a scene of this or we'd love to get a scene of that.
Okay, thanks for that. VALMONT, you had a last question before we go to the floor?
I guess I wanted to prompt you a little bit to talk a bit more about the craft aspect of your approach. Did you have a particular idea about how you wanted the film to feel? And maybe to respond to my earlier question about being a musician, making a film, can you maybe comment a little bit on that process?
Let me start with that, VALMONT. So as a touring musician and balancing this kind of fine line between filmmaking and music has been very exciting, but also quite challenging, just trying to like balance out the time. And so for us, when we first started this film, being down at the coast and just like really immersing in the rich musical heritage, especially the kind of mainly kind of traditional cultural music that was happening. It was just really nice just be in that space and be inspired and absorb. But I had never at that point thought of me doing the score for the film. And it was only later as I was speaking to Chris and to our editor, where they were saying, have you thought about you maybe essentially scoring the film? And I was actually quite hesitant at the beginning because I didn't want to put myself in it. I mean, yes, it's kind of in terms of being a co-director, co-producer, you're there, but you're kind of behind the camera. And I was feeling a little bit uncertain about that. But after some discussion and some persuasion, and also at that point, I was already kind of recording, a lot of ideas. And so then from there, then it just became kind of quite the natural thing to do, was be able to then create a score. And I think kind of once that had kind of hit into my head, the idea of creating a score, it was this idea of how can this kind of become a spiritual kind of guardian for grandma and for the other elders, just in terms of those hummings. And the first song that you hear is a lullaby, a children's lullaby, which actually Carissa had taught me. And it's kind of much faster. And so for me, it was just how do we then slow it down, and how do we kind of create this kind of very high pitchness, which has this kind of overarching blanket over Nyanya and the other elders, I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would say that, obviously kind of Maia having been there over the 6 years, and the two of us and everything we'd been through, we'd been on, Maia was hospitalized with a motorcycle accident. We'd met elders who passed away. It was just such an emotional and I guess personal, intense experience. Hearing all of that come out in Maia's voice, besides the directing and all the artistic choices. For us in that edit room, when Maia first kind of sat in a room and started experimenting, we loved it immediately, and loved what it did to the film. And as someone who'd never composed a score before, it just felt like a huge achievement. She also worked, Ricardo, our editor, connected us with his long-term composer, Ken Meyer in Toronto, who worked with Maia and really built up the kind of sonic landscape, the string arrangements and piano, after Maia had composed everything just with her guitar and voice. For us, we're really proud of how that came out. And it is available if you want to hear it on Spotify or Apple Music. It's all there.
And 12 minutes left, so it'd be nice just to be able to take some questions from the floor, if that's okay. I think Christie's disappeared. I don't see her up here. There's a question from the floor that she asked. I don't know if you might be able to speak to that, but it mentions that in the film, witchcraft seems to be a manifestation of socio-economic failures around land. And how does this manifest in the South African context? I mean, VALMONT, I don't know if you have any thoughts, or I don't know if Steve, maybe you can speak more about to that in a Kenyan context, perhaps.
Yes, I could speak to that. So it is, so I think it's actually not a direct cause-effect relation, but so witchcraft provides one of the vocabularies that is used to understand that question of inequality, denial of dignity, and exclusion. But it is not that witchcraft causes, because if you look at also the works of South African authors, Jean and Jane Komarov, they tend to argue that this occult space is an importation of many other elements in the neoliberal system, just like casino. So we also have Pentecostals doing the same. I've always argued that the role played by the bars in the shebeens, witchcraft, Pentecostal, evangelical, and some other, Maskani movement is often the same. So it's not a direct relational kind of thing.
Okay, then we have another question that relates to the overall theme of the panel directly. Please, can you talk about planning an impact campaign around the film? So I would be very interested to know, what would the impact be? What would you be targeting if you are planning an impact campaign? Yeah,
we are actually currently mid planning. I think for us, essentially, the first thing was how do we show this film to the communities on the ground, and to then be able to kind of really create kind of a lot of discussion and dialogue, but also understand what it is from the community themselves as to how do we work in this space, and what is it that they're looking for, or what are the suggestions that they can give us to then be able to create something more impactful and effective. So we're going down there in a couple of weeks to kind of have discussions with governmental organizations and focus groups with different groups of the community. So that is all currently in movement. And what did you want to add?
I was just going to add that we're also speaking to some potential partners in
South Africa. I was going to get there.
Go for it then.
No. We're also talking to some potential partners in South Africa, to Heinrich Bol in Cape Town, to also try and see how we can use the film to also be able to to create discussion and dialogue and speak about these issues happening not just in Kenya but South Africa, and I'm sure the rest of the continent.
And something encouraging so far is that we've been getting a lot of messages on Facebook, especially in relation to the trailer and reading about what the film kind of explores. A lot of people who've reached out, who've gone through very similar experiences. A lot of friends we know from all sides of the continent, and even friends in other parts of the world have very similar stories of how this has happened, either within families or also in connection to priests who are demonizing people in their congregation and accusing them of being witches and things like that. So it definitely feels like something that can needs to be spoken about. So we're just hoping the film can be used whichever way to start those conversations.
Yeah. And also kind of online awareness campaigns also within people in the cities, I think is important, because a lot of people in Nairobi didn't know that this was happening. So how can those conversations also be brought into the fold, which is also important.
So it sounds like your approach to impact follows a level of exploration and openness to what the film says to different people, which is probably, I think you're going to get a lot richer results from that as well. Okay, then we have another question. I'm glad to see Christie is back with us, because I think maybe we could put that to her. Christie, is your microphone on? Are you with us? Okay. Yes. All right. So there's a question here. There are a lot of patriarchal issues in the film, from grandma not being able to and forced into marriage to Ansawari not allowed to build a home on the family land. To what extent can these issues be explored in relation to the film? So I was wondering, could you possibly, also given the focus of the organization that you're part of, could you maybe speak to issues around patriarchy and perceptions of witchcraft or traditional healing?
Oh, it's quite a broad topic. Okay, so
or in relation to the film, maybe as it's manifests in the film.
I'll try and read it in as much as I can. So. Obviously, we very much know that over the years, witchcraft is something that has been very much associated with women. It's not something that's been associated with men. It's only recently, in recent times, where it's also been associated with men. In the history of witchcraft, it's been the vilifying of the agency of womancy. Whether in the UK, whether in Africa, whether wherever. I'm referring to the UK because the Witchcraft Acts began in the UK, and then with colonization, the Witchcraft Acts then took over the African context and then completely vilified culture and heritage. So one of the things is we're looking at Nyanya, as the viewer had already said, where she has no agency over who she married. She has no agency about raising the kids or not. It's her fault that she's lost her kids. It's her fault that there's issues in the family. Everything is on her shoulders, and I mean, maybe not in context to the film, but maybe in context to social issues in Africa, because we've already established the voice of the film according to the creators of the film. So maybe to conversations within the African context, we are speaking to how do these unsettling, intangible accusations being already attached to groups of people that already have so much stigma attached to them. How do you begin unraveling those stigmas? Because, for instance, where and how would you begin in the film speaking to how do they prove that it's witchcraft? You know, and how it was automatically attached to the mother hen grand elder of the family, and how in spaces in African contexts, the vilification of anything begins with judging a woman for doing something incorrectly, or for not upholding a cultural practice correctly, or for being defiant because of wanting to uphold certain traditions. So perhaps Nyanya may have been wanting to uphold certain traditions which the young people never understood, because perhaps she was living an intersectional identity where she was dabbling within her traditional understanding of self and within, you know, the newer Christian understanding of self, and where her identities intersected. So how, you know, where the how aspect, I would have loved to know the how aspect of how that was attached to Nyanya, and why Nyanya and why nobody else in the family, perhaps, you know, because then that also gives us an understanding, because we just came with witchcraft was attached to Nyanya, and witchcraft was attached to those grand elders that were in that safe home. So, you know, the understanding of how it was attached to Nyanya, and how those very patriarchal stances, say for instance, Carissa's uncles, where Carissa's uncles and Carissa's uncle's wife is not necessarily willing to understand from Nyanya's aspect, and takes Carissa's dad's word for everything, and where Carissa's dad is able to interpret some of those things she says. What is the basis of those things that Carissa's dad was able to interpret, and why so much weight to what Carissa's dad was able to say and Carissa's uncle was able to say, for instance, just in a gist.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. Okay, so Steve, Maia, before we move to the last question, do you want to add on to that?
I think it's interesting, Christy, that you're kind of just bringing kind of Carissa's dad into the fold, because a lot of comments have been, you know, from a kind of very African patriarchal standpoint. Carissa keeps bringing it back to his dad, but as filmmakers, why haven't we chosen to hear the dad's side of the story? And that has come up a lot. So I think just from that kind of in terms of, yeah, I mean, it was just too many voices coming into the mix. But I just wanted to add that as a note.
Okay, so then there's the last question, which I guess is just more of a clarificatory question. Please, can you explain what the traditional oath is and its context in the film? So I guess, I don't know, Steve, if you want to speak about that, or Maia and Chris, if you want to answer first.
Go ahead. So Kiapo is a traditional oath, and there's many ways that this traditional oath can be taken. One in particular, which we did not see because I think it is extremely sacred and extremely spiritual, is you know, with papaya seeds, which are very strong, you know, used in spiritual traditional practices. So the traditional oath essentially is being able to rid yourself of this spirit or of this thing that is within you.
Okay, we seem to be losing Chris and Maia. It was a bit of a bad connection. Could you say that again?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Well, no, just I don't know how much you heard, but just the end there is that I suppose it is traditional oath is something that you then go through to then be able to cleanse you of whatever it is that you're being, that you're feeling or that you're being accused of, or and how you come out the other side and how you're then able to relate, I think, then with the community once again after you've
how oathing can be applied to really any issue or any conflict from somebody who like as a mediational tool, and also as a unifying tool that brings a whole community together to mediate in a way that, like the cleansing that we saw do. And the oathing ceremonies we witnessed were extremely peaceful and beautiful in a lot of ways. That it was built to strengthen that.
Okay. Kristen Meyer, we're losing you there. I think maybe it might be easier to put your video off for the last few minutes and just maybe put it back on. We've just lost you there.
Sorry about that.
Could you maybe repeat your last line if you don't mind?
I was just saying that what we really saw was that the oathing's ability to really strengthen the fabric of community, which was in stark contrast to the way we saw this Pentecostal cleansing ceremony that really kind of drove divisions and amplified those divisions. So that's kind of part of the understanding of the oathing that we got.
I have a comment.
Okay.
I have a comment on this. So I agree with Chris' explanation, and perhaps I'm glad perhaps you didn't use it yet in the film, because the oathing area becomes very slippery also, because oathing is not something specific to Giriama or African population. Oathing is a struggle that human societies have always had in terms of building or moving towards what they would call authentic truth. And right from the 17th century, we see oathing introduced in the UK courts. But as usual, as you know, there is this distinction that is given now between traditional oathing and oathing. So oathing, which, for example, when it's used in courts and other situations, me and you, I see we have rings, is a vow, is an oath. It's just an oath like the Giriama oath, but there is this thing about primitivizing oaths done by non-Western societies, and valorizing oaths done by within the Christian tradition mostly, or secular tradition. So I think one has to be very careful that it's a very slippery category that can take us back to this alterities. So I'm glad you haven't used it yet, but when you get to use it, I think one must be very careful that you're not caught in that criminalization. Thank you.
Okay, no, thanks for that. So guys, we have run over time. I'd just like to take the opportunity for each of you maybe to make a concluding comment. If you've got anything extra just to round off our discussion. VALMONT, anything you'd like to add?
Once again, I just want to congratulate you on this film, on the kind of quality of engagement that it invites. I really enjoyed it, and that's all I've got to say.
Okay, Christy, any thoughts?
I think thank you. Thank you for starting a conversation that people are not willing to have. Sorry for that. I think my Facebook is, sorry for that. My Facebook was open and I didn't mute my laptop. So thank you so much for a conversation that people are struggling to have and that are not willing to have because of the fine lines in intangible values behind the conversation that you were having, and getting a lot of, making it being a very controversial conversation because of distinctions between traditional practices and witchcraft, and, you know, one not being able to prove against the other, and spaces where, I mean, the blatant killing of elders and then blaming witchcraft, which is like that's insane. I mean, for me, that is witchcraft on its own. I mean, it's an evil happening, you know, and people have been very, very sensitive about having these conversations, because there have been no clear distinctions between what is and what isn't, and how it isn't defined and how it is defined, and whether there actually is just a universal definition of any of these things. And in your film, it very much, it's given us a platform to understand that I don't think there is universal definition for any of these things. These things can only be experience-based, and thereby saying that your truth on its own is enough. So thank you for validating and for bringing up conversations that people are willing to have, aren't willing to have because they are worried about being invalidated. Thank you so much, and please continue. Please continue.
Thanks, Christy. And Steve, any last thoughts from you?
Thank you. Want to really thank you and the UWC for inviting me to this conversation. And really, Maia and Chris, I want to offer two invitations to you. One, I work with several academics from the coast, basically on the question of violent extremism. And whenever we've done that, the issue of the Kaya forests have come in. And so I'll be happy if we can organize for a film watching with them and just get what you think. Finally, I'm also an activist, apart from teaching. And I'll be very happy to get to know the kind of reactions that the ordinary Mijikenda people are having on this. And I hope we can get in touch and learn from that. Thank you very much, and all the best.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so to round off, I'm just to say from a personal perspective, I'm really happy with the way the film worked out and the successes you have. I mean, as you know, I've been involved with DocuBox in some way or other for the last 8 years or so, and it's just really amazing to see the films working out so fantastically and doing so well. So please keep up the good work. You have a very good Kenyan presence this year in the world, and let's hope it continues. And thanks again to Encounters and to the 100 Ball Foundation, and also to VALMONT and Steve and Christy for making today possible. And we look forward to future films.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Cheers, guys.
Yeah, and we look forward to keeping in touch with you all individually also.
Okay, great. Okay, bye then.
Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks, Mandisa.
Thanks, Mandisa.
Thanks again.